5 members of was the driving force behind the violence, or merely one piece of a far more complicated picture, would become a question for the courts. What detectives did know was that this tragedy hadn't erupted without warning. According to prosecutors, it unfolded gradually, patiently, almost methodically. And if their theory was correct, the first act of violence didn't begin with 5 victims. It began with one, a killing that, they allege, set off a chain of decisions from which there would be no turning back. No family wakes up one morning expecting to become the center of a homicide investigation. The warning signs, if they exist at all, usually seem ordinary at the time. A teenager pulling away from home, more arguments than usual, doors slammed a little harder, phone calls that stretch late into the night, new friendships that older relatives don't trust. Individually, none of it appears extraordinary. Looking back, that's what makes them so unsettling. According to family members, the turning point in this story began with a relationship. The 15-year-old granddaughter had started dating Ymier Davis, a 16-year-old from the East St. Louis area. Like countless teenage romances, it began quietly. But relatives would later describe a relationship that quickly became all-consuming, one they believed was changing the young girl's behavior in ways they no longer recognized. To those closest to her, she seemed increasingly distant from the family that had raised her. Time once spent at home was now devoted to Davis. Conversations became arguments. Disagreements hardened into resentment. Relatives reportedly tried to intervene, believing the relationship was unhealthy and urging her to end it. From their perspective, they weren't trying to control her life. They believed they were protecting a 15-year-old from a relationship they feared was leading her down the wrong path. Whether she saw it that way is another question entirely. Teenagers often interpret boundaries as opposition. The more adults push back, the more fiercely they defend the very relationship those adults are trying to stop. It's a pattern played out in homes across the country every day. Most of those stories end with heartbreak. This one, prosecutors allege, ended with something far darker. Publicly, several relatives would later suggest that the family's opposition to the relationship had become a source of growing tension inside the household. But investigators didn't build their case around family opinions. They searched for evidence, and according to prosecutors, they found it. As detectives extracted data from phones and digital devices, they uncovered what they allege were conversations between the two teenagers that painted a deeply troubling picture. During detention hearings, prosecutors referenced text messages they say discussed moving a body and targeting additional family members. Those allegations have not yet been tested at trial, but if proven, they would suggest something investigators had feared from the very beginning. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was something prosecutors believe had been discussed beforehand. That possibility changed the entire direction of the investigation. Because crimes committed in the heat of the moment leave one kind of evidence. Crimes that are allegedly planned leave another. Investigators began rebuilding the days leading up to the first killing, comparing phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. Slowly, a timeline emerged, one that prosecutors believe began not with 5 murders in a single day, but with one death that allegedly set everything else in motion. According to their theory, Cherie May became the first victim. What happened afterward, prosecutors allege, transformed an already horrifying homicide into a cascade of violence unlike anything East St. Louis had witnessed in years. If their reconstruction is accurate, every killing that followed can be traced back to one chilling problem. The wrong people kept arriving at the wrong place at the wrong time, and each arrival, prosecutors say, created another witness who could never be allowed to leave. If prosecutors are right, the massacre didn't unfold in a single burst of violence. It unfolded over days. That's perhaps the most haunting part of this case. While life carried on across East St. Louis, people going to work, children riding bicycles through their neighborhoods, traffic moving steadily along State Street, members of one family were allegedly disappearing one by one without anyone yet realizing they were pieces of the same tragedy. According to prosecutors, it began inside Cherie May's apartment. Exactly what was said in those final moments remains known only to the people who were there. But prosecutors allege that, after Cherie was killed, her body wasn't immediately discovered. Instead, they say it was concealed inside the apartment, hidden from view while the outside world continued as normal. Neighbors passed by. Cars came and went. Somewhere beyond those walls, families were preparing dinner, unaware that the first chapter of a far larger tragedy had already been written. Then came an interruption no one had anticipated. Devin May arrived. He wasn't a police officer responding to a disturbance. He wasn't a suspicious neighbor peering through a window. He was Cherie's son, a young man simply looking for his mother. Prosecutors allege that Devin unknowingly stepped into the apartment, expecting answers, only to become the second victim. It's a detail that lingers because it speaks to the randomness of timing. Had he arrived earlier, perhaps the story changes. Had he arrived later, perhaps it changes again. Instead, according to prosecutors, he arrived at the precise moment when his presence allegedly became a problem that could not be ignored. 2 family members were now dead, yet no one outside that apartment knew. If the prosecution's timeline is accurate, the violence didn't stop there. Investigators allege the focus then shifted to Patricia May, the 74-year-old grandmother who had spent decades holding her family together. Court filings presented during detention hearings allege that Patricia was persuaded to come to the apartment, believing she was responding to an ordinary request from someone she trusted. Think about that for a moment. Not a stranger, not a masked intruder, someone from her own family, someone she had every reason to believe would never place her in harm's way. According to prosecutors, Ymier Davis was waiting. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing allegations in the entire investigation. Prosecutors allege Patricia was shot after entering the apartment, and that discussions between the suspects included taking her money. Those allegations remain part of the state's case and have yet to be tested before a jury. By now, investigators believe 3 generations of the same family had already been devastated. And still, the killings were not over. The violence no longer appeared confined to a single apartment. According to investigators, it spilled into other parts of East St. Louis, where Shania Thompson and Quentin Thompson would also lose their lives. 2 more relatives, Tiffany Thompson and Santosha Scott, survived gunshot wounds, becoming living witnesses to the aftermath of a family that had been torn apart in a matter of days. For detectives, the geography of the case became almost as important as the victims themselves. 3 crime scenes, multiple victims, different locations, 1 family. It was as though investigators were assembling a photograph that had been ripped into pieces and scattered across the city. Every new address they visited revealed another fragment, and with each fragment came the same unbearable realization. This wasn't a string of unrelated murders. According to prosecutors, it was one continuous sequence, one decision leading to another, one killing creating the circumstances for the next. By the time Illinois State Police began tracing phone records, interviewing witnesses, and following the suspects' movements, they weren't simply trying to identify who had committed the crimes. They were trying to understand how 2 teenagers allegedly crossed a line from which there was no return. Because if the prosecution's theory is true, the most chilling part of this case isn't how it ended, it's that, according to investigators, there were moments along the way when everything could still have stopped. Instead, the violence kept moving forward until there was almost no family left to destroy. For a brief moment, it must have seemed possible. Possible that the truth could be buried alongside the victims. Possible that the silence inside Cherie May's apartment would outlast the questions outside it. But homicide investigations have a way of dismantling even the most carefully imagined plans, not all at once, one piece at a time. By the time Illinois State Police had secured every crime scene, investigators weren't looking at isolated acts of violence anymore. They were looking at a timeline, a living thing that expanded with every interview, every surveillance camera, every cell phone record, every digital breadcrumb left behind by people who believed they still had time. The dead could no longer speak, but their phones could. As forensic analysts began extracting data from mobile devices, prosecutors say a disturbing picture started to emerge. During detention hearings, they described text messages allegedly exchanged between Ymier Davis and the 15-year-old girl, messages they contend discussed moving Cherie May's body and what to do next. If proven in court, those conversations would become some of the prosecution's most consequential evidence, suggesting that the violence was not merely survived by chance, but followed by deliberate decisions. Digital evidence has changed modern homicide investigations. People lie. people forget. Phones rarely do. Every message carries a timestamp. Every call leaves a footprint. Every movement creates a trail waiting to be reconstructed. Detectives weren't relying on a confession. They were rebuilding the story minute by minute, comparing what the evidence appeared to show with what witnesses remembered seeing. Then came another break. Authorities identified a vehicle they believed was connected to the suspects. Officers located it and initiated a pursuit before bringing it to an end with a PIT maneuver, forcing the car safely to a stop. Inside were the two teenagers investigators had been searching for. The arrests marked the end of the manhunt. They did not mark the end of the investigation. If anything, the most difficult work was only beginning. As officers searched the vehicle, prosecutors alleged they made a discovery that underscored the sheer brutality of the crimes. During court proceedings, they stated that investigators recovered a severed thumb from inside the vehicle. Prosecutors further alleged that the juvenile girl identified it as belonging to her grandmother, Patricia May. Those allegations remain part of the state's case and have not yet been tested at trial. Even seasoned investigators are trained to separate emotion from evidence. But there are moments in certain cases that linger long after the paperwork is filed. This was one of them. News of the arrests spread quickly across East St. Louis. Residents who had spent days wondering whether a dangerous killer was still moving through their neighborhoods finally had names. The relief was immediate. The disbelief lasted much longer. According to prosecutors, the suspects weren't strangers passing through the city. One was 16, the other just 15. Old enough to understand the consequences of violence, yet young enough that many people struggled to comprehend how they had become central figures in an investigation of this magnitude. Then came the detention hearings. For the first time, prosecutors publicly laid out the sequence of events they believed had unfolded over those devastating days. Piece by piece, they described a case built on forensic evidence, witness accounts, digital communications, and the movements of the two suspects before and after the killings. The defense, however, urged caution. An allegation is not a conviction. A prosecutor's narrative is not a jury's verdict. The legal process had only just begun, and in a case this extraordinary, every claim would eventually have to withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. For the families left behind, though, the proceedings could never restore what had been taken. No hearing could return Patricia to her grandchildren. No verdict could give Devin's daughter her father back. No sentence could rewrite the final conversations Shania and Quentin never knew would be their last. The investigation had answered one question: who prosecutors believed was responsible. But another question, perhaps the most difficult of all, still lingered over the entire case. How does a 15-year-old girl allegedly reach the point where the people she has known all her life become the people prosecutors say she helped destroy? That question would echo through the courtroom long after the flashing lights had disappeared from North 40th Street. By the time the case reached a courtroom, the crime scenes had already been cleaned. The yellow tape had come down. The evidence boxes had been sealed. The apartment on North 40th Street no longer echoed with the voices of crime scene investigators calling out measurements and evidence markers. Outside, East St. Louis slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Cars rolled through intersections. Children walked to neighborhood parks. Storefronts opened each morning as though the city itself was trying to convince everyone that life could continue. For one family, it never would. Courtrooms have a peculiar way of stripping away emotion. Every unimaginable tragedy is reduced to exhibits, photographs, witness testimony, and legal arguments. The language becomes clinical. Dates replace memories. Evidence replaces people. Yet behind every page of testimony in this case stood an empty chair at a family gathering that would never again be filled. Prosecutors began outlining the case they intended to prove. According to the state, this was not an impulsive act born from a single argument. They argued the evidence pointed toward planning, a sequence of decisions that continued long after the first shot was fired. They pointed to digital communications, forensic evidence, the movement between crime scenes, and the arrests that eventually brought the investigation to an end. The defense saw something different. From the very beginning, attorneys for Ymier Davis urged the public not to mistake allegations for proof. They reminded the court that detention hearings are not trials and that every accusation still had to withstand the burden of evidence before a jury. As for the 15-year-old girl, prosecutors sought to move her case into adult court, arguing that the nature of the allegations demanded it. The legal battle was only beginning. But outside the courthouse, another battle had already taken shape. It wasn't over guilt, it was over understanding. How does a family arrive here? Not at the moment the sirens appear, not at the moment detectives knock on a door. Years before that, somewhere in the quiet spaces where relationships begin to fracture so gradually that no one notices the cracks until the entire foundation gives way. Relatives would later speak publicly about the teenage relationship they believed had pulled the family apart. Prosecutors, meanwhile, suggested financial motives may also have played a role in at least one of the killings. Whether either explanation, or some combination of both, ultimately tells the full story, remains a question the courts have yet to answer. Perhaps the popular narrative suggested that the 15-year-old girl did it because her boyfriend asked her to do so as part of their plan to elope together into a new world of their own, with new identity. However, the evidence presented so far suggests something far more layered, far more tragic, and far more difficult to reduce to a single motive. At the center of it all was a family, a grandmother who had spent decades watching her family grow. A mother, a son, a brother, a sister. Lives measured not by the way they died, but by birthdays they celebrated, meals they shared, and futures they believed were still waiting for them. That is the part these cases often lose. The headlines remember the suspects, the families remember the laughter. As this case continues through the justice system, prosecutors will present their evidence. The defense will challenge it. Witnesses will testify. Jurors will eventually decide what has, and has not, been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Until then, the East St. Louis family massacre remains exactly what it is today, a criminal case still awaiting its final chapter. But regardless of how the legal proceedings end, one truth has never been in dispute. An entire family was shattered, and in the span of just a few days in July 2026, generations of shared memories, traditions, and futures disappeared forever, leaving behind a silence that no verdict, no sentence, and no courtroom ever truly has the power to fill. Some crimes are remembered because of how many lives they claimed. Others are remembered because of where they happened. This one will be remembered for both. Long after the courtroom arguments have faded and the headlines have disappeared beneath newer tragedies, the address on North 40th Street will remain more than just another location on a city map. For one family, it became the place where an entire bloodline was forever divided into two chapters, before July 2026 and after it. The legal process will continue. Prosecutors will present evidence. Defense attorneys will challenge every allegation. Witnesses will testify. A jury, and only a jury, will ultimately determine what has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That is how justice is meant to work. But courts answer legal questions. Families spend a lifetime living with the emotional ones. How does a grandmother unknowingly walk into what prosecutors describe as a carefully orchestrated trap? How does a young father leave home expecting to check on his mother and never return to his own daughter? How do brothers and sisters, who once shared birthdays, holidays, childhood memories, and family photographs, become names connected by police evidence markers instead? Perhaps those are questions no verdict can ever truly answer. Because this story isn't simply about who investigators believe committed these crimes, it's about how fragile the idea of home can become. We grow up believing that home is the one place where the world can't reach us. It's where birthdays are celebrated, arguments are forgiven, and children learn the faces they'll trust for the rest of their lives. But every so often, a case emerges that forces us to confront a far darker reality. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't waiting outside the front door. Sometimes, it already has a key. For the May family, what should have been an ordinary summer became the final chapter of generations of shared history. A grandmother's wisdom, a mother's love, a son's future, a brother's laughter, a sister's dreams. Lives that deserve to be remembered for how they were lived, not merely for the way they ended. Perhaps that's the greatest tragedy of all. Murder doesn't just take people. It steals birthdays that will never be celebrated, chairs that will forever remain empty, and futures that survive only in photographs. As this case continues to make its way through the justice system, one thing remains certain. 5 members of one family are gone. 2 survivors will carry those memories for the rest of their lives. and an entire community is still trying to understand how a family that spent years building memories together became the center of one of Illinois' most heartbreaking criminal investigations. Sometimes, the most haunting part of a true crime story isn't the violence. It's the silence that's left behind after everyone who knew the answers is gone. If this case left you with more questions than answers, you're not alone. Some of the most compelling investigations do exactly that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe this tragedy was the result of a single motive, or do you think there is a deeper story still waiting to be uncovered? Leave your perspective in the comments below. If you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on the evidence rather than the noise, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never forget that sometimes the most extraordinary mysteries begin in the most ordinary places. Here is another devastating story that spread fear, anxiety, and disbelief throughout the community, that took detectives years to solve.